Well, today we're going to talk about zoning and specifically the First Baptist Church situation. They've applied for a conditional use permit to function as a community center, and that issue came in front of the Planning Commission on Wednesday. And Janata, you were there. What was the tenor of the discussion? This has been going on for a couple of years, and the city was hoping to move everyone towards a resolution. Does it feel like we're almost there?
It feels like we're not there. We're pretty far from being there. It seems like in a zoning sense, we may be approaching a resolution. In a community sense, it seems like the two sides are still pretty entrenched and still kind of far apart. Mm-hmm. And I know we had a story about a month ago when they had a community meeting at Jordan School when everybody aired their grievances, and it seems like we're kind of approaching a kumbaya moment, but it became clear this week that it's still very much kind of the tensions are still simmering, and there's still a lot of outreach and that needs to be done, and a lot more kind of communication between the church and its neighbors has to take place before all the parties are satisfied. But at least in the zoning sense, from the city's perspective, things are getting a little bit closer to being resolved. As you mentioned, the Planning Commission discussed it, and they actually voted to approve what's known as a conditional use permit. Mm-hmm. It's when you're doing something that's not strictly allowed by law, but you ask the city for permission for kind of an exception, and they specify under what conditions these exceptions could be given. So the commission did decide to approve the permit, but even in doing so, there was a lot of debate and a lot of kind of disagreement about what these conditions should be. And even in approving it, they took a stance that was pretty far from what staff's stance was. So when it gets to the council next month, it'll be hard to predict what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. So it's very much a moving target still.
Yeah, I'm glad you phrased it as both a zoning issue and a community issue, because I think this is a situation that has so many different layers. There's also kind of the short-term fix versus maybe long-term policy that the city could roll out, and just the whole idea of the evolution of church buildings within Palo Alto. There's a lot to unpack here. Well,
I think that's one of the reasons this is such a complicated issue, is because it touches on so many things. I mean, from staff's perspective, this permit that we're talking about is just something that pertains to First Baptist Church in a specific situation. Mm-hmm. But as the commission discussed the issue, it became clear that members believe this is going to set a huge precedent and is going to have huge implications for churches throughout the city, and how the community views them and what uses should be allowed. Mm-hmm. So it seems like the closer we get to resolution, the more issues come up and the more complicated it becomes.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any sense of the breakdown between at First Baptist between religious activities and then these commercial uses? Like how many, not specific hours, but like is there more of the non-religious activity going on now?
Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot more non-religious activity, secular uses, and I think staff acknowledged it, and I think the church acknowledges that as well. And their position is congregation has declined. It used to be like 600 people way back in the day. Church has been there since like the 40s.
And what is it now? Do you know?
I think it's like less than 100. But they're saying we still have to like do our upkeep, maintain this great building that we own. So this is our way to kind of get the revenues needed to do that. And what they're saying is that's not just us, that's how churches operate today. All churches do that. So when you're saying we cannot have these secular activities, you're basically kind of undermining the function of a church. And they're also saying that what we call secular is actually very related to the church's functions. Mm-hmm. I think Pastor Rick Mixon, who was from First Baptist, was making the case Wednesday. He basically said it's a very thin line between the sacred and the secular in this case, because you have groups, who provide like counseling service, provide like kind of therapy to troubled teens, and he sees these kinds of services, while not overtly related to religion, as being very much in keeping with the mission of the church and the reason it was established. So.
Yeah. Now, some of the tenants are louder than others, and I think that is causing the most frustration for some of the neighbors. There's a girls' choir, correct? There used to be a music school.
Yeah, and I think, and just to get back to Elena's question for a second, the new Mozart School and I Sing Silicon Valley Girls Chorus were the two kind of biggest and loudest tenants. Most people, and they have singing and music. New Mozart's gone, so I feel like right now we're getting back down to a level where there's fewer tenants. There's two permanent tenants, I Sing and a therapist, and then there's like 3 groups that use it once a week. like a Persian school, Persian
dance.
language, Persian dance, and I think Apple Women's Chorus.
There's another chorus,
another chorus that meets just once a week and is much smaller. So I think we're down to like 5 or 6 tenants, 2 of them regular. So still quite a bit of activity, but I think it fell off a little bit from the last few years, but definitely more than the church has had throughout its history.
So this is a situation, though, where some progress has been made, some changes have been made. It's not like sides are sort of facing off and neither is compromising. We had a guest opinion this week in which the pastor, Rick Mixon, as you mentioned, detailed some things that the church is doing or has done, the noise issue. They're getting double-paned windows. I guess when the music school was there, the windows were open because it was so hot inside the building, so now they're getting air conditioning. There's a drop-off zone that I believe the city established.
There is,
There's a communications venue for complaints and notification. There's scheduling. So even despite that, you're saying that there's still a lot of heat.
There's still a lot of heat, and it seemed like the two sides were getting closer last month. I mean, I think we reported. I mean, the biggest moment of the meeting, like one guy got up towards the end and said, "I'm going to pay for your HVAC so that you can have air conditioning. You can close the windows. You know, it'll be less noise." Yeah. Everybody was happy. It was like kind of great. And actually, the pastor Mixon said Wednesday that HVAC was supposed to be installed the following day, which was Thursday, yesterday. So I guess there is progress being made.
Yeah.
Icing has been doing a lot. I mean, they've been doing a lot of outreach. They have like weekly mails to like all the parents telling them to be mindful of neighbors, to not park illegally, to kind of not sit in their car double parked, things like that.
Yeah, that could be annoying.
Yeah, and then you know, at the community meeting, Jenna Delp, who's like the Icing co-founder and director, she basically gave out her email and said, if you see anybody parking illegally, we're there. Just tell us. We'll monitor. We'll have our people outside, getting people to kind of respect the neighbors. So it seems like there's some progress made, but it was clear this week that the progress that was made is still kind of far from satisfying the neighbors. And just to illustrate, this is the packet from the meeting. A lot of pages here. I think the staff report actually goes like up to here, and the rest is like comments from neighbors, letters, complaints. It's like over 100 pages. Wow. And then there's a supplemental of ones that came in later. Not all of them are opposed. You know, there's a lot of supporters for the church, mostly from parents of Icing kids and that kind of stuff. So, you know, it's not just opponents, but certainly still a lot of acrimony.
Yeah, I think it was someone from Icing who was saying that there's a group of people who have written multiple letters.
Right.
Like that there's implying that there's
they're saying maybe the majority of the complaints came from 6 residents, as they say.
Yeah, so maybe overrepresentation.
Maybe, but there was a lot of people at the meeting. The chamber was filled. There were like 50 people at the community meeting back then, and I mean, I've heard from way more than 6 people about it.
Yeah.
So I mean, it makes sense to me that the people who live closest to the church would be complaining more. But I don't think we could discount the complaints of the neighbors just because a few families have been, you know, sending way more complaints than others.
Yeah.
I'm curious, were the commissioners swayed by the pastor's argument about, I mean, his sort of almost more spiritual definition of what a church is versus the legal zoning definitions?
Well, I think one commissioner was swayed by the pastor's argument, and I think the rest of the commissioners were swayed by that commissioner's argument based on the pastor's argument. This is kind of another issue with the Planning Commission. This is kind of a different Planning Commission than we have in the past. It has personalities. It's a bit factional, and it's a little hard to predict how they're going to go and things. Basically, Michael Alchek, who's, you know, he's kind of the most outspoken member. He quite routinely challenges the staff and kind of takes issue with their recommendations. So when the discussion started, he basically led off with like a 20-minute speech, basically saying that the city should not have asked New Mozart to leave. They shouldn't have done any evictions. Basically, the staff jumped the gun on all this, and he sided very much with the church and with Rick Mixon, and over the last few months, I guess staff has been working to kind of come up with the exact conditions that they thought would kind of balance everyone's interests. You know, let the church have its tenants, but have these hours, set a certain number of people, and basically Michael Alchek basically took issue with almost all of these conditions and urged his colleagues to basically revise them all, get rid of a clause that basically specified only nonprofits would use them, instead of allowing 50 people in an event, raising it to 120, having the hours go to like 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. as opposed to 7. Like all these things. These are the things that the church kind of requested because they wanted more flexibility. But after the commission voted, like I was talking to the pastor like outside, and he was just basically, wow. he was kind of surprised. Yeah. So he had to stick around to like thank Michael Alchek because it was like he kind of became the church's hero at that meeting.
Yeah.
And he also made a point that his own congregation has things like yoga and things like that. He took issue with the idea of judging between nonprofit and for-profit. If you host like a musician from international who wants to come in and he gets paid to entertain a congregation, are you going to like not allow him because he got a fee or that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
He brought up some examples. And his point is, before we do anything, before we restrict anybody, we should have like a full conversation about what a church is, what kind of uses we want to allow in churches. And once that's done, we should start kind of regulating.
So this is the second time recently that the city or city commissions have kind of wrestled with, do we go for the short-term solution now for this specific group, or do we go long-term? I mean, we've seen it in the affordable housing discussion as well. There's a project that Palo Alto Housing has proposed, and the Planning Commission wanted to go for the majority, for a PC zone there while the discussion on affordable housing zoning continues on. And here we have a similar situation in which at least it's raised the question of, maybe we should be thinking kind of citywide, maybe we should be thinking all churches, let's regulate all of them all at once and not deal with this on a sort of piecemeal basis. The idea of precedence is kind of interesting. I think that's something that Alchek brought up. Like, are we doing this, even though we're just doing this for one church, are we not kind of implying that this would be okay, or this would be the process for other churches as well?
Well, I think this could be a process for churches, but the specific conditional use permit would be different for whoever goes through them, and it would consider like the actual setting. Are you what the zoning district is? Are you in a neighborhood like R1 zoning or somewhere else? You might have different rules for like a church on Hamilton Avenue.
Yeah.
So, but in a way, like even though the commission with the dissent of Doria Suma, who did not like who dissented from the majority, the commissioner generally agreed with Michael Alchek, but they still approved the conditional use permit. I mean, and I think what this says to me is that yes, the philosophical argument is important. It would be great to have this community-wide debate. But in the meantime, it's like, what are you going to do about First Baptist? Are you going to wait a year? Are you going to kind of just ignore the residents, or are you going to strictly follow the law and staff's interpretation of the law and kick out icing and some of the therapists? So I think at the very least, like both sides agree that the conditional use permit, while not a perfect solution, at least allows them to keep this kind of tense truce for a while. And maybe in the long term, there will be a discussion about what a church means, but this is Palo Alto, so it's not going to happen in a month or in 2 months. So it's one of those long-term.
Yeah.
I mean, the role of the church. I mean, it takes some years to approve a development on University Avenue. It's going to take centuries to figure out what a church's function is in the community.
Yeah. So the city just wanted to take care of this. I mean, this is the commission; it's not the council yet, but they wanted to take care of the situation and address all parties. The evolution of a church, I think, is kind of an interesting question. A lot of churches these days aren't going for owning buildings. They're just kind of moving into like community centers or elementary schools on the weekends, buildings that exist that aren't being used when they need to do their worship services. And I think that's a really good point. But what do you do with an empty building? And what do you do with an empty building that wasn't really structured to be anything other than a church? There's 8 parking spaces, I believe.
Right, off street.
So which kind of suggests that when it was built in the first place, people were probably walking to church, and they were probably walking from that immediate neighborhood. And now, like, everything's changed where people are driving to get to, their congregation somewhere. So Mixon kind of raises this issue because his church is in the situation, but I'm sure that there's dozens of synagogues and other communities of faith that kind of would wrestle with this.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the underlying issue is when you change the church's function from a place that serves the neighborhood as a congregation versus a place that has tenants or partners or lessees, whatever you call them, you start to attract different people, meaning people from outside the immediate neighborhood, and it creates all sorts of problems. And I don't think the church was really prepared for those kinds of problems and those kinds of impacts until they've had to kind of take care of them, because the neighbors kind of understandably raise these issues up.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
it's pretty complicated. So it's a pretty evolving story, but yeah.
Yeah. This isn't the only mismatch of kind of the evolution of a building in a neighborhood and the consequences of that. Castellea.
Yeah, I've been thinking. I was about to say, it reminds me of that very much, especially with the neighbors, and Castellea saying, we, in order to do our work and our mission in the same way as serving, women who want to be educated, and there's this demand for that. They need more space, and then they're just clashing with the neighbors on that.
Yeah, we've only got this space to deal with right now. So
you guys aren't the only people who made the Castellea connection. The opponents of Castellea attended the meeting. Yeah, so there were a few people from the Castellea opposition speaking, basically publicly saying, if you're going to oppose the church's plans, be prepared. You're going to be called bullies. Kind of coaching the opponents in opposition to to the facility. So the two are kind of linked.
So it's bringing some people together.
It is. Yeah, they're uniting.
Conditional use permits, are those revisited? So if the council grants the First Baptist Church the permit now to be functioning as a community center, will it come back in a year, or does that depend on complaints, or how's that handled?
It depends on the permit. There was some discussion about creating a sunset clause, a conditional use permit, so I know that mechanism does exist. They chose not to go that route.
Talked about that.
But I think the conditional use permit gives the city a lot of discretion to pretty much do whatever it wants. Maybe not whatever it wants, but they could set a lot of specific conditions, including you have to return in a year to kind of show us your progress. And the commission was also really big on trying to encourage the church to kind of do these kind of neighborhood initiatives voluntarily, just to kind of ease the tension. Allow the neighbors to use your patio for the neighborhood, the block party or the barbecue, things like that. To kind of, one commissioner, Shema Gardias, wanted to see the church commit to continuous improvements every year to addressing these concerns, which there was a lot of discussion about what exactly does that mean. But so there's all sorts of other things being explored, but how many of them can actually be quantified in a conditional use permit?
It's kind of challenging.
I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, I kind of wonder, whenever we have these situations, Castellea reminds me of this as well, if anyone's tried to do any kind of mediation, the church or the icing people, whoever the major tenant is, with the neighborhood, just to get the most vocal people together and see if there can be some sort of discussion. That doesn't seem to be in the city's toolbox, generally speaking, that kind of mediation. Or
I thought they tried to do that in the community meeting on Friday, and to some extent at the commission meeting, because both sides were there, and everybody acknowledges that we're trying to strike a balance kind of thing. But and also, when you dig through the packets, there's plenty of correspondence between city planners and neighbors saying, "Can we meet in a group? Can we talk about this?" So I do think the attempt has been made.
So the planners were trying to get the.
I think there's been small meetings happening. Grandma and the guy who's working on this, you could see his correspondence. Can we meet? Can we talk? So I think you could talk to people, but it doesn't mean you're going to convince them. And it does seem like there's still quite a bit of gap between what the congregation wants to see and what the neighbors want to see happen out there.
Yeah. All right. Well, May 14th, tentatively speaking, it'll come to the council, and then we'll continue the discussion there. I'm sure there'll be more happening in between. Hopefully, some mediation or some discussions between the parties.
Yeah. See what happens.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for the discussion. Well, that wraps it up for this week's Behind the Headlines. Please hit subscribe or like below if you want to do either. We're always on paloaltoonline.com. You can check there for the latest news. To discuss this topic, go to paloaltoonline.com/square. We've got the editorial this week. We've got a guest opinion, and of course the article that Gennady wrote. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as well. And we'll see you next week.